you never get away from NASA and the ethics office, which kind of goes along with some of the comments that Michael was talking about earlier. You know, Michael mentioned something that I found very intriguing, and it was the statement that he shared with you from, I'll tell you, from the head of IT security, when he talked about playing by the rules. I have a book that I recommend to you that may fit with some of the things that you do, and it's called Don't write it. Don't worry about it. You won't read it anyway. It's called Normalization of Deviance. How many of you some of you, since you're in the risk business, may have read the book, Normalization of Deviance by Diane Vaughan. If you have any relationship to the space program, you know it intimately because Diane wrote it and became very famous in talking about its contents after we lost Challenger in 1986. Essentially, what the book talks about is seeing things that aren't exactly right, but convincing yourself that they're within the bounds of okay. So they're sort of okay. Normalization of deviance is something that we run into in any profession or in any field. And you as CEOs and risk managers and people who are looking at compliance, you run into this all the time, and I would just caution you. Be very careful as you say, well, this isn't exactly what we had hoped for, but it's okay. We haven't hurt anyone yet, or we haven't had anyone locked up yet, or we haven't had anyone do whatever the other things are just yet. So we found it quite embarrassing to us as an agency because we've lost 3 vehicles over the course of 3 human-rated vehicles over the course of NASA's 60-year history. Apollo 1, the Apollo 1 fire, Challenger in 1986, and then Columbia in 2003. And in every one of those 3 accidents, we could always go back and see where we had been victim to the normalization of deviance, where we knew there was something wrong that we should have fixed, but we said, okay, it hasn't caused us any problem just yet, so let's just truck. Let's just keep going. So I offer that to you only as a thought. I have a few slides that I'm going to use in the background. Don't pay any attention to me. Pay attention to the slides because they're pretty. And they, every once in a while, they ask provocative questions, like the 3 questions in this slide. It's what people at NASA, and I am no longer with NASA. Adam knows that, but this is a commercial. I can now do commercials for the space agency. When I was the NASA administrator, I'd go to jail for lobbying and doing commercials. But this is a free, non-paid commercial for the greatest space agency on the face of the earth. And the second greatest organization, the second greatest organization to which I ever belonged. I spent my entire adult life up until a year ago, 1201, January 20th, last year, ended my years of federal service. I had not had a job as an adult outside of the federal government in all that period of time. So that other organization, French, is the United States Marine Corps. So between the Marine Corps and NASA, I want to try to share some things with you, and French is going to come back up here, and I think we're going to engage you in questions and answers. I have 2 rules, though. Rule number 1 is you can ask questions anytime you want. Like I said, I have some slides. You don't have to look at any of them past this one. So ask questions whenever you want, particularly when French comes up here, because he wants to keep his job. And his job is to generate questions today. I don't know what he does after that, but today he's supposed to generate questions. Second rule is there are no dumb questions. You can't possibly ask a question that somebody else in this audience doesn't have in their mind. So please, my period of time spent with NASA, I was known as the dumb question asker, because I knew that there were other people in my organization that wanted to know the same things I wanted to know, but didn't have the courage to ask the question because they didn't want to seem like the dumb person in the room. So there are no dumb questions. Incredible view of our planet. I'm one of the people who was privileged to look at it from this perspective, and people ask a lot of times, you know, were you changed or stuff like that, and I tell them no. In terms of faith, which is generally what people are asking about, it was strengthened because you look at this planet This picture doesn't do it justice because with these incredible cameras that we've been given, Earth is unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. If you were not an environmentalist before you go to space, you become one when you go there because you look at the planet and what people consider to be its fragility, and you recognize the fact that no, our planet's not fragile at all. It's us, the people who live on it and depend on it. If you look right between the blackness, which is space, and the planet itself, you'll see a very thin blue line. And if you close one eye and put your thumb up, you'll see the same thing we can do when we're out in space. And we like to do it a lot of times. You float into the window, and you close one eye and put your thumb up, and our atmosphere disappears. So it gives you a feel for how important it is for us to take care of our atmosphere and the planet. When you talk about technology, today we have a satellite orbiting Jupiter called Juno. It is a one-of-a-kind satellite because it's the first time we sent something to what we call the outer planets that did not have a nuclear power system providing its energy. The energy comes from 3 big solar arrays that use new generation technology that allows us to take just the energy from the sun to power this satellite today. We just launched about a month and a half ago an incredible lander that's called InSight. It's the result of work with France, Germany, the United States, and others of our partners. This will be the first lander to go to Mars if it's successful, or I'll say when it's successful and it gets there in another 6 months or so. It will be the first instrument that's able to give us the body temperature, the pulse, all the vital statistics on Mars, because it actually has a heat flow probe that goes about 3 meters into the surface, gives us the interior temperature of the planet, has a seismograph that tells us about its tectonic activity, if there's still any, and it also helps Curiosity, which is there right now, in giving us the daily weather from Mars, so things we're doing. This is an absolutely incredible technological feat. I think its legacy, however, will be how it's brought nations of the world together for 18 years now, 17 plus, we're going on 18 years, living and working on the International Space Station. How many of you have kids? Any of you have kids that are 17 years or younger? 18 years or younger now. Your children, those of you who just raised your hand, they have not taken a single breath, not one breath in their lives when people have not been living and working on this thing. So Adam went through this with me when I became the NASA administrator and we finally phased the shuttle out. We suffered the slings and arrows of everybody who told us that we had ended human spaceflight. We couldn't understand it because we were living on the International Space Station then, and here we are some 10 years later and we're still living and working on the International Space Station. Biggest difference between when I flew and when they fly today, I was a camper. So my long mission was 9 days. A short mission on the International Space Station today is about 4 months. We have had people live on station for a year. Most people live there for 6 months, and so it's an incredible place to be. There's the James Webb Space Telescope, a little bit delayed, so we'll launch it end of next year or early 2020. And this is what we're doing today. This was the transition that was made. When you talk about risk, and your corporate risk, your business risk. We accepted the risk of moving from a NASA-operated launch system, the space shuttle, that we operated for more than 30 years, absolutely incredible piece of technology. But we decided that if NASA is going to go on to deep space, go back to the moon, on to Mars, we needed to get ourselves free of providing transportation to low Earth orbit. So we made a business decision to call on American industry and our partners to provide the capability of getting from Earth to space to low Earth orbit. And that's what we do today. So you've got a public-private partnership among NASA, companies like Orbital ATK, SpaceX with the Dragon, and soon to be Crew Dragon that we're going to test at the end of this year, and then sometime next year, Dragon, along with the Boeing CST-100, will become the first commercially provided means to get humans into low Earth orbit. And then the Japanese experiment, or what we call the HTV, Japanese cargo vessel, and then our tried and true, believe it or not, Russian Soyuz spacecraft, which is the way we've been getting our crews to and from space since we lost Columbia in 2003. I'm going to show you this. Hopefully this will work. It's loud because I know it's early in the morning, but in case you didn't get your cup of coffee. But we're always criticized because people tell us, particularly people on the outside of government, tell us that, yeah, but all the stuff you have is just on a drawing board. I'm going to show you about 2 minutes worth of work that's going on right now. You'll see some artist concepts in it, but most of what you see is actually your neighbors and friends in places like San Diego, California, Stennis down on the Mississippi Delta, the Kennedy Space Center out at Edwards Air Force Base, making hardware and building hardware that's going to provide us with the capability to go to Mars with humans. So you're going to see construction of the Space Launch System, a heavy lift launch vehicle, the Orion crew module, and so enjoy because you're a taxpayer. Oops. Okay, I need for you to do it for me back there. Just start it. We're ready. This is in Michoud, outside of New Orleans, and it's what we call the barrel section. It's the big fuel section that carries liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen for the Space Launch System. This is down at Stennis on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. If you like fire and smoke and noise, you want to move to Stennis. This is Utah, and that's the advanced solid rocket motors that provide the propulsion to get the vehicle out of the atmosphere and on its way into space. And this is down at the Kennedy Space Center, where they're actually assembling and testing the Orion crew vehicle right now. You're going to see an image come up where you'll see the vehicle with fire all around it. That is not an artist concept or anything. It's actually a pilot's eye view looking out the window of Orion coming up right here. That's the way that the crew is going to see their vehicle as they re-enter Earth's atmosphere coming back from the moon and Mars when we fly Orion. That was a first test flight we flew on it without a crew in December of 2014. I have to admit, I was a little disappointed that Orlando didn't win out, because if you get to Orlando, you got to go over to the Kennedy Space Center, where you actually get an opportunity to walk through the facilities where they're putting all that stuff together. Get to see Jeff Bezos' massive manufacturing and production facility for his company called Blue Origin, where they're going to move manufacture of their rockets from Kent, Washington to Orlando, Florida to launch there. See the launch pad where we launched Apollo 11 is now run by SpaceX, where they launched their big Falcon Heavy vehicle a few years ago. I just wanted to let you know that, the same way that you operate internationally, NASA today is perhaps America's, this is my personal opinion. If there's anybody here who ever worked with the State Department, they will probably differ with me, but I think it's one of the greatest soft power tools that this nation has. Today we have more than 800 active international agreements with more than 120 partners. And that's everything from basic fundamental STEM education all the way up to the International Space Station and deep space exploration. So that's kind of what your space agency does. The future of flight, we're looking at supersonic vehicles that fly without making a big sonic boom, so we'll be able to fly over ground at supersonic speeds, going from here to Paris, maybe an hour instead of the 7-8 hours it takes you now, going around the world in a couple of hours. When we talk about going around the world, there is a spacecraft that I didn't show you called Dream Chaser by a company called Sierra Nevada out of Louisville, Colorado. When they start flying, and if they're successful with their human-rated version, we'll be able to take you and a small group of people from the Kennedy Space Center over to Lyon, France, land on a regular runway, and then they'll stick it back in a C-5 and bring it back to its launch site, reprocess it, and that's coming in your lifetime, and so stand by. And French, you can start working your way back up here, because the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is what I think is critical to everything you do, and it's diversity and inclusion. So as I look around this audience, I'm real happy with the number of women here, not real happy with the number of minorities in the room, but that's typical. That's just the way it is today. But I will offer a couple of pieces of advice. When you hire, you have to be intentional if you're serious about diversity. You have to decide that we are going to make this a diverse organization. However, diversity by itself doesn't get it, because then you have to be inclusive. This is Katherine Johnson. Some of you saw the movie Hidden Figures. If you didn't see it, go see it. Take your kids, take your parents, take everybody, because it's a movie about us. It's a movie about the United States of America and this great nation and the diversity and the incredible amount of talent that we have if we choose to use it. But the inclusiveness is the most important part. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to French, and we're going to try to see if we can answer some questions for you.
Thanks, John.
That's all.
I have to say, my goodness, this is like a dream from when I was a kid, being able to sit up here with you, General. My uncle was World War II vet, 96 years old, NASA engineer, Apollo program, and I hope he's watching this right now on live streaming. So, you know, one of the things that I've noticed over the years, and whenever I went to look for what's next in risk management, I would say for about the last 10 to 12 years, I've seen NASA at the forefront. Could you maybe just give us a little bit of background on NASA's risk management program?
NASA, like any technical organization, is challenged all the time with the same kinds of things that your companies are: quality control, safety. And so we put it kind of foremost. When you look at NASA's core values, safety is one of those core values. I was real happy to see some folk from USAA here, my insurance company for life, by the way, free commercial. But the chairman over there right now, I think, is still Les Lyles, and General Lyles is an example of the expertise that we seek in NASA outside the organization to help us manage our risk, to help us think about those things that may be misses on our part, that we utilize people on the outside. So Les chairs what's called the NASA Advisory Council, and it's a group of outside experts that we bring in with expertise in the various areas, whether it's science, human exploration, technology development, human capital, or whatever, to look at how we're doing things and whether or not we're accepting too much risk, or how do we bring about the type of quality that we want. So it's first and foremost in the things we do.
Right. Well, and by the way, we're going to be able to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question at any point, raise your hand, and we have people who are looking for your hands to go up. Also, I believe we're going to be able to take questions online. So when you see the URL up behind me, feel free to go ahead and submit questions online if you don't want to raise your hand. I'll be looking for those questions as well. So while we're getting that turned on and to work, I'm going to ask one more question, and hopefully we'll have a few questions from the audience there. You mentioned Jeff Bezos, and of course Elon Musk doesn't need any promotion. There's sort of the government risk culture. I think NASA is, in a way, kind of in between government and private sector in the way it approaches risk. What do you see as far as these innovators like Bezos, Musk, Branson as well? What's the difference, and what's NASA doing bringing them in the first place? Don't they bring risk with them when they do that?
Anything we do involves risk, and what happens when we made the decision that we were going to go into expanded public-private partnerships, it actually decreased our risk from the standpoint of cost and schedule, and being able to do the broad things that NASA wanted to do. When we didn't have to worry about access to low Earth orbit, we could buy that service. We found that it initially was a lot of work working with some of the entrepreneurial space companies, because they really like constant change and turnover. So it was a cultural adjustment for them to learn that when they worked with NASA, configuration control was really, really, really important, and that they had to decide and agree with us on what configuration they were going to fly for us, which is a little bit different for them, but they've come along very well. We've learned a lot from them. SpaceX was one of the first partners that we had that came from the entrepreneurial side of the tracks, if you will. We learned a lot from them about innovative manufacturing and production, so I think it was a cooperative effort. We spent 2 years sitting down with all of industry and trying to allow them to help us look at our requirements, whether it was engineering specifications, human safety ratings for a human-rated vehicle, and because they felt that, okay, some of the requirements that NASA has are a little onerous. They're also out of date because they were generated in the Apollo era. We're no longer there. The technology is not the same. And so for 2 years, we went back and forth looking at their standards, the NASA standards, and came to a compromise on where we were going to be. So if you look at the human rating standards today, it's sort of a mix of what we got from industry and what NASA had on its own.
So I just have a question on also another question on these innovators. Could you maybe compare and contrast Elon Musk to Jeff Bezos and how they're approaching space?
The tortoise and the hare. How many of you remember the story of the tortoise and the hare? And I'll let you figure out which one to switch. But they are both very incredible innovators. Really good risk takers, smart risk takers. But as you mentioned, not very many people know that Jeff Bezos is in the space business. He has a company called Blue Origin that is, actually when you talk about achievement, they've spent most of their time in suborbital testing, but they were actually the first company to do what was truly reusable spacecraft. So whereas SpaceX was the first company to fly a vehicle into space, bring the first stage back and land it at the launch site, Jeff and Blue Origin was the first company to actually launch a spacecraft into space, bring the first stage and the capsule back down near the launch site, put them back together, fly them again, and they did it 5 times before they changed out any components. So the first 5 flights of Blue Origin were with the same vehicle, whereas in SpaceX's case, they flew about 5 or 6 flights on new vehicles each time before they finally recycled one. It is something that still, the jury is out on reusable spacecraft and whether they're as economical as some people say. That was the space shuttle's claim to fame, was it was America's first reusable spacecraft. We made a conscious decision after the very first flight, STS-1, that we were going to disassemble the vehicle. We took the engines off and took major components out, and once you do that, then you're bought into non-true reusability. So that was the reason that with NASA and their reusable spacecraft, we never got to where the Blue Origins and the SpaceXs are today.
I tell you, it was just fascinating watching those rockets land back on Earth out of a 1950s sci-fi movie. We have a question from the audience, and then we'll get to some of these questions that are right down here that people are sending in, General. So, yes, sir.
I'll just do it really loud.
We got you through the mic.
Well,
because I think we're
recording.
They're looking for.
My question has to do with space telescopes. I think the Hubble is amazing. Put it in the same category as the Gutenberg printing press and eyeglasses. What will the James Webb? What are a few things we'll learn from the James Webb telescope that we can't learn from the Hubble telescope?
Yeah, we didn't talk a lot about. I showed you James Webb, and I didn't point out to you how big it is. One of the things is it's massive compared to Hubble or to any telescope that we've ever launched. If you paid any attention to the picture itself, you'll notice it didn't look like any telescope you've ever seen, and that's because it has 18 segments. It's a segmented, it has a segmented mirror on it that has 18 different elements. They all tune themselves behind each of those mirror segments is, I think, 7 actuators that can actually adjust it individually so that the focus is perfect, and we don't have the problem that we initially had with Hubble, which was a ground single mirror where we had an imperfection around the perimeter of it. But James Webb is a little bit different. Hubble is across all spectra in the electromagnetic spectrum from infrared all the way out to ultraviolet. James Webb focuses just in the ultraviolet region, which means it can sense and see things that we would not be able to see otherwise at much greater distances. So when my astronomy friends tell me and astrophysics friends say, please don't talk about the edge of the universe and all this other stuff because it doesn't really exist. We're going to be able to look out to the beginning of time, to the edge of the universe, and see planets that we're now identifying that we think may be like Earth. We call them exoplanets. They're Earth-like planets orbiting other stars in the universe. We've discovered some 2,000 plus now with Hubble and Kepler and a number of other orbiting telescopes as well as Earth observing telescopes. And so James Webb is going to allow us to look into the atmosphere of these Earth-like planets and other galaxies and other solar systems and actually tell what material is in their atmosphere. Is it oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, or is it something we don't even know about? And maybe even tell us whether there is potential for life in these exoplanets. And what makes it something an exoplanet is we call it's in the Goldilocks zone. So if you remember, again, if we go back to fairy tales and stuff like that, the three bears, the porridge, not too hot, not too cold, but just right. The Goldilocks zone is an area going out from a star that's not too hot, not too close to the star that the planet just cannot sustain life, and it's not too far out that it's so cold that it can't sustain life, like some of our outer planets. But it's just right, like in the region where Earth and Mars happen to be, where we think life can be sustained. So we're looking at about 2,000 plus planets around other stars like that, and James Webb's going to allow us to look into their atmosphere.
That's amazing. And we have a number of questions here from the audience right here. Well, I can start with let's start with the second one, then we can go to the first. So, as administrator of NASA, how did you really, anticipate the risk acceptance? Okay. How does NASA actually say this is how much risk we'll take?
Let me try to dispel a myth. And this was a myth that arose out of the movie Apollo 13, when one of the flight directors by the name of Gene Kranz, when we finally realized what had happened, that the side of the service vehicle had been blown out from the explosion of an oxygen tank, I wasn't around at the time, but it's still made the determination that we were probably going to lose a crew. That not only were they not going to be able to land on the moon, that was the farthest from what was going to happen, but we didn't think we could get them back to Earth. So we had to start thinking of ways to come back. And Gene Kranz is alleged to have made the statement when they closed the doors on mission control, and he looked at the flight control team and he said, look, failure is not an option. What he meant was we cannot allow these guys not to come home. People have expanded that to say that NASA is risk averse and that, we're not allowed to fail. The first thing I did was said there is an acceptable level of risk that we can assume. We adopted a saying, fail early, fail smart. You're always gonna have failures, so in any system you're developing, try to put as much risk in as you can at the very outset to see just how far you can stretch the technology and then kind of neck it down as you get farther and farther along. So when we talk about whether it's the James Webb Space Telescope or a human spacecraft, we want the risk to get lower and lower as we get closer and closer to launch time. So that was sort of the way we did it.
That's interesting. So you essentially were trying to increase your risk tolerance.
Exactly, yeah.
By doing that. And then there's a related question there. It's number one, can you maybe share a little bit about balancing the interests moving quickly versus mitigating risk? Are those compatible?
Exactly, and they are compatible. It's when we made the decision that we were going to go to buying a service, purchasing a service for access to low Earth orbit, going to American industry, entrepreneurs and the like, it just wasn't in NASA's DNA to be able to turn new technologies as fast as they did. the main reason is they don't develop a lot of new technologies. They take the results of years and years of development, either from DoD or from NASA, and then apply them to systems that they can try this, try that, and everything. So we look to them to provide the speed and the flexibility. We provide the stability and the real focus on quality control and safety, but push it down to them such that they have to comply with the standards that we set. So that's sort of the balance.
So does NASA still maintain that its long-term focus is on deep space versus low Earth orbit for private sector?
Yeah,
do the private sector guys agree with you?
The private sector guys agree to an extent, and we have what we call commercial ideologues. And when I first became the NASA administrator in the Obama administration, the commercial ideologues, their philosophy, and there were a lot of people who, I don't know if anybody here worked in government during the time of the Obama administration, but the commercial ideologues said, okay, get NASA out of the business of putting people in space and doing things because they're just too slow. They don't adjust. They're not willing to accept risks. They're not willing to do these kinds of things. Just take the money from them and put it in the private sector. Couple of things they didn't realize. 85% of NASA's budget goes through the agency into the private sector in the first place. We have never built a major spacecraft. It's always been done in conjunction with American industry. If you look at the Saturn V was built by North American Rockwell, now Boeing, with the oversight of NASA. Today we use another technique called insight instead of oversight. And oversight was we dictated the pace, we dictated the standards, we dictated everything. We didn't know, we found out later that we didn't know as much as we thought we knew about what was going on. Today we utilize a practice called insight, where we have people who are embedded into the contractor facilities, so they see what's going on day in and day out. They offer advice if asked, but they don't tell the contractor we don't tell them how to suck eggs. We tell them we want a boiled egg or we want a scrambled egg, and we don't tell them how to do it. I want it soft, but that's about it. And we find that that's, one, much more efficient. It instills a sense of pride in them, a sense of safety consciousness and everything, because they're working side by side along their NASA counterparts as a part of a team and not competing entities. So they turn out to be incredibly invaluable to us. The point about turning low Earth orbit over to the private sector, to industry and entrepreneurs, absolutely essential to be successful at that if NASA and our international partners, our government agencies, want to go to deep space, particularly with humans. Doing everything is way more expensive than any single nation or any single entity can do. You asked me about Elon. No, he is not going to Mars. Maybe one of these days. It's really, really hard to get to Mars. We've had one nation in the world get there successfully on the first attempt, and it was India. And it was when they launched something called the Mars Orbiter mission that's now orbiting the planet, providing us data about Mars's lower atmosphere. But that was a lot of intense effort all the way to orbital insertion with the folk at JPL, with the NASA folk there. So it's international collaboration, it's public-private partnership, and that's what's going to allow us to do these grand things that everybody says we're going to do.
Okay, I believe we have another question from the audience here.
Yeah, I had a question about heat shield tolerance. When you look at your shuttle missions, you always see tiles falling off. And so is there a tolerance, expected tolerance?
Yeah. Well, let me correct one thing. You never saw a tile fall off after we flew Columbia from its production facility out in California to the Kennedy Space Center. That was a shock to everybody. That was a problem of adhesives. What actually bonds the tile to something that was called a strain isolation pad, a flexible pad underneath that allowed the aluminum skin of the shuttle to expand and contract as it went into space and came back without popping tiles off. We never lost a tile once we started flying shuttle. The issue was that we were concerned with was damage to tiles because it was like holding a piece of styrofoam in your hand. The tile that protected the shuttle had a coating on it if it was on the bottom to increase its heat resistance capability. When we lost Columbia, that was one of these cases of normalization of deviance, if you will. We had spent an inordinate amount of money and time at the very beginning of the shuttle program looking at ways to prevent tile from coming off, to prevent tile from being damaged, and then if it happened, how do we repair it on orbit? We finally developed what we thought was an acceptable means of tile repair. One of the things we never paid any attention to was the leading edge of the wing, the leading edge of the tail, which is a different material called RCC, or reinforced carbon-carbon. Everybody thought it was the strongest material in the world. When we lost Columbia, after a piece of foam hit the left wing and penetrated it and left a small hole which led to the destruction of the vehicle during reentry, we found out that the fiberglass skin of a Corvette is stronger against impact than the leading edge of the shuttle. It was designed to be able to resist 6,000 degrees of heat, not impact, because we never envisioned that, that here's the normalization of deviance. All the way through the shuttle program, we never got to the point where we could completely stop the loss of pieces of foam from the external tank. And it just turned out that if you remember the way shuttle was, the external tank actually extended a little bit beyond the nose of the shuttle. So the shuttle rode to space on the external tank. That's what carried the whole structure, all 4 million pounds of it. And as foam would shed from the external tank, just the airflow in the atmosphere sometimes caused it to go up and hit on pieces of the shuttle. So that was the thing we were worried about, was impacts to tile, not impact to the leading edge of the wing, and that was what cost us the loss of a vehicle.
Let's see, we have a few more questions here. But there was one I think that kind of dropped down a little bit, and that was really about some of the I guess the most common risk, well, actually it's still up there. So what are the types of risk metrics that you think NASA monitors? What are the key?
Yeah, we use a 5x5 risk matrix in almost every program we have, and so we look at programmatic risk, operational risk, safety risk, quality misses and the like, so they're all folded in. And when you look at the 5x5 risk matrix for any mission, you may find something in the upper right corner which is really, really red that says the probability of it occurring is relatively high and the severity when it happens is dramatic, it's catastrophic. You really don't want to have things up in that area. I think if you're familiar with the risk matrix, but we fold everything, those different types of risks that I talked about, into the risk matrix. And an operational risk could stop a program as much as, say, a safety risk. The loss of the vehicle through some impact, if we were talking about shuttle, to us was as well the loss of the program through extensive over-budgeting or extensive time to complete the program. Those were all things that fit on the risk matrix also.
Well, we've had 3 administrations now that have said that we're going back to the moon and to Mars, so 3 in a row.
Yeah.
One of the questions here is, it's been 50 years. When are we going to get back?
Well, we've never left the moon, so and we've been at Mars for 50 years. I'm not being cute. Even though humans did not go back to the moon, lunar exploration has continued, has actually expanded. One of our partners in lunar exploration is a country that many people would not believe we work with, and that's the Chinese. They're a close partner in lunar exploration. They've actually had landers. We've had landers. We've been on Mars either in orbit or with rovers and landers for the last 50 years. We just launched InSight that I talked a little bit about before. In 2020, we have another rover that's ironically called the Mars 2020 rover. We don't have any fancy name for it yet. But the 2020 rover is actually sort of not the last step, but it's one of the final steps toward finding out about Mars's atmosphere and whether or not we're correct in our assumption that we can sustain life on the planet. We actually have there's an experiment called MOXIE it's an acronym, so I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's actually going to take carbon dioxide out of the Martian atmosphere dissociate it so we get breathing oxygen, oxygen that can be used in propellants, and demonstrate that we have that capability. And then after that, we're pretty much ready to start thinking about sending humans. But for the next 10 years, you're going to see NASA back in the lunar environment with humans, orbital flights, eventually putting someone on the surface. Ideally, that will be done by commercial enterprises and not NASA, because the commercial entities should have the capability to do that today, and that will allow NASA to continue their focus on getting humans on Mars. So there'll be NASA astronauts back on the surface of the moon, but my guess is you'll probably see some of these private space ventures that will actually put people on the surface of the moon also.
Thank you. And we have a question over here.
I'll talk louder. There we go. First of all, I want to thank you for being an advocate for diversity and inclusion. I truly believe it adds a competitive advantage to companies if they embrace it appropriately. So thank you for doing that. I do have a question. I was one of those Challenger kids back in 1986 in the classroom when that tragedy happened. And I guess looking at today and the innovations today, in today's geopolitical environment, what is the impact of our international partnerships with today's geopolitical environment on safety?
I usually don't say this. That is an absolutely phenomenal question, and it's a when I talked about soft power, exploration today, whether it's in science, human exploration, technology development, or the like, the reason I highlighted soft power is because there are nations in the world that we're not getting along with very well today, except NASA. The partnership that we have with Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, where's Adam over there? You know, I'm not going to ask Adam to yes or no, but if you find him sometimes afterward, because his community, the legal community, was engaged from the very beginning in arising at the treaties that we brought Russia into the International Space Station program sort of as an afterthought. You know, President Clinton was smart enough to recognize when the Berlin Wall fell that if we didn't do something to capture the talent and keep it from going to really bad places, they would go to really bad places. And you probably spent a lot of time in the Pentagon talking about this. And so NASA was mandated that we find a way to work the Russians into the International Space Program. They have turned out to be an absolutely incredible partner, because from the day we lost Columbia in February the 1st of 2003, we needed a way to get our crews to and from the International Space Station because we had crews on station with no way to get them home. And so we made the decision way back then, some 15 years ago, that we were going to rely solely on the Russians to get our operating crews to station, the 6 people who operate the station day in and day out. And we were going to use the shuttle because it had a capability of carrying 7 people at a time, only 2 of whom couldn't do spacewalks, the 2 pilots. But we were going to use the shuttle to translate the maintenance and construction crews. And that's what we did for the next 10 years until Space Station was completed. You look at the Chinese. We work with them, can't work with them in human spaceflight just yet because of prohibitions from the U.S. Congress, but we work with them in planetary science and geodetics, looking at earthquakes. When we had the earthquake in Kathmandu, Nepal, a little bit more than a year ago, just so happened that there was a joint team of Chinese and NASA scientists up in Nepal at the time, looking at glacial characterization in the Himalayas. So we were able to bring to bear the assets of both countries and trying to help the people of Nepal in recovering from the earthquake. So absolutely essential, the international partnerships that we have today.
We have a question over here.
Great. Hi, thank you so much. It's been so informative. A lot of us are here also thinking about organizational design. Can you talk to how NASA manages? You have a centrally managed program and how everyone embraces it?
I'm going to brag on people. My deputy the last couple of years was an incredible woman by the name of Dava Newman from MIT. She is a professor in aeroastro at MIT, holds probably 10 patents on spacesuits. That's her passion, is developing spacesuits, because the suits we use today, when you see an astronaut do a spacewalk on the International Space Station, not a bad suit for what it does, but we need a much better suit. The joints are not not perfect. And sometimes we get injuries with astronauts just because of the form, fit, and function of the suit. Diversity, again, going back to diversity. What happened by having Deva come in as my deputy, she brought this concept called innovation. And initially it kind of insulted people like me, old-time NASA folk who said, wait a minute, we are the innovation organization. And Deva was calm. And she said, yeah, but you know, you're talking about technology and stuff like that. I'm talking about organizational innovation, business practice innovation in so many different other ways that allow the workforce to get involved in transforming the organization, making it even better than it is. And so I think if you went to NASA today, you'd find that they brag about their innovation in organizational structure, innovation in governance, the way that we determine what's going to be done. As the NASA administrator, man, you talk about no power. I had it not. Because we had set up a governance structure that had two lines of communications to me. One was the technical line that came up through what we call the associate administrator, the senior civil servant in the agency, and then the administrative or organizational line that came up through the deputy. And they made the critical decisions at their level, and only if something, there was some gross disagreement or argument did it ever come to me to resolve the difference. And that was a change for us in that type of organizational structure. We organized ourselves into what we call decision-making councils, and those were the 3 or 4 organizations at the very top of the heap where all of the final issues came for resolution and the decisions were made.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Oh, over here, Michael Rasmussen has a question here.
Oop.
Michael, go ahead and ask your question. I'll repeat it. So this is Michael Rasmussen, one of our analysts from GRC 2020, and his question here, alluding to the integrity message from our CEO, is looking at the future. Are we headed more towards a Blade Runner's future or a Star Trek future? I wanted to make sure. I figured it was Star Trek, not Star Wars, but Star Trek. Star Trek or Blade Runner. Those are the two extremes.
It's a good thing you asked me this question today, because I finally saw Blade Runner 2029 last week on my way back from Portugal. It's not Blade Runner. I am the eternal. Now, I have to admit, I am the eternal optimist. And even in this day and age, you got to remember, I'm a child of the 60s. I graduated from high school in 1964. Schools in South Carolina were segregated. So we were talking about Clemson University and the University of South Carolina. If I'd stayed home, I could not have gone to my first choice, which was Clemson, because schools were segregated at the time. I had a difficult time getting to the Naval Academy. I could not get a congressional appointment because I had people like Strom Thurmond, Olin D. Johnston, Albert Watson were my 2 senators and my congressional representatives. So I wrote a letter to the President of the United States. I said, hey, I need help. And never heard from him, but a few weeks later I got a visit from a Navy recruiter who said, hey, I understand you want to go to the Naval Academy, and then later got a visit from a retired federal judge that President Lyndon Johnson had sent around the country looking for qualified young men. And back in those days, there were no women, so otherwise he'd have been looking for qualified young men and women the way we do today. But that was how I got to the Naval Academy. I got an appointment from we were talking about Chicago, from Congressman William Dawson in Chicago, Illinois. That's the way I got to the Naval Academy. So, philosophically, I have to be the eternal optimist. There's nothing that we see in how things are going that we haven't seen before. Not talking about personalities, but talking about how things are going. So, don't be discouraged, but pay attention to the normalization of deviance. I've tried to make it very clear that's not just about technical things. It's about organizational arrangements. It's about administrative things. It's about normalizing our resistance to diversity and inclusion. Saying that, well, the thing I used to hear when I was a Marine Corps recruiter and we were going around looking to bring in more minorities into the officer program and women. Well, the pool's too small. We just don't, there's nobody in the pool. And I'd go, bullshit. Excuse me. The pool is massive if you go to the right places. If you go to historically black colleges and universities, if you go to tribal colleges and universities, you go to, dominantly Hispanic colleges and universities, you will find kids that are just as qualified as anybody else that you have in your organization today. That is a normalization of deviance to accept someone who tells you there is no one in the pool. So don't believe it if you're a recruiter or you're somebody. Be intentional in your recruiting and in your promotion and your retention. But mentor people. Remember, I would defy any of you in this audience to include your former CEO and present CEO to say that they never made mistakes and that they had it. I mean, they were right on top of everything from day one. I was a bumbo. Even after I got in the space program, I almost gave up, getting ready for my first flight after I killed my crew in the simulator. So none of us were as good then as we think we are now. So be intentional in your recruiting and in bringing diversity and inclusion to your organization. But remember, people have to be mentored, and they have to be nurtured and made to be as good as you are now, because you didn't just go there.
Thank you so much, General. Big hand. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so very much, Jim. Thank you.